All right, welcome back. I hope you had something to eat and something to drink. I hope you're ready for this last session of today's event. I've been looking forward to this session the whole day because it has to do with one of my favorite topics. I go a bit out of the limb here to say it's about aliens, but they can adjust that when they get on stage. Madsen, a Danish filmmaker, is working on a project. It's called The Visit, where he asks the question what to do if we actually have a visit from outer space, in conversation with astronomist Madsen Dominik from the University of St. Andrews. And they'll have the stage for the next 1.5 hours. Give them a big round of applause.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Martin, for coming and having this conversation about some clips from the film. It's still in the final editing. Some days are still left. So the clips you'll see are not with the final sound design, but I think you can get a feel of it. Perhaps... I hope that we'll have an interesting conversation. I'm personally very pleased that Martin is here, because Martin has been a help in making the film, in the sense that I've had discussions with him about who should be the experts participating in the film. And also Martin has been doing the first real the first in-depth discussion about this subject matter at the Royal Society, which is the world's perhaps most heavy scientific institution, at the 350th anniversary. So just hearing those conversations at that 2 or 3 day seminar was an inspiration for me. But now I'm really just a victim of whatever Martin comes up with.
So what we are going to do, we'll show you some bits and pieces of the film, which will last about 30 minutes. And then we'll start a conversation between me and Michael about the film. And at some point, you're invited to join in the conversation. We'll see how it goes. So first, enjoy the film.
Okay, so now you've seen 4 clips from different parts of the film, just so you know.
So after having seen the film, I actually wonder about how did you come up with the idea to it?
Well, the idea behind the visit is simply I think that if we would ever meet non-Earth-like, an intelligent life, I think that would be the most significant event for mankind ever. So I thought that it would be interesting to ask the question, what would we actually do? And this version now, these scenes, you did not see the names of the different experts, but the films and the experts in the film are essentially people who, in a real scenario, would be the persons who you would most likely be calling upon. For example, Chris McKay, who is talking about biology. He's one of the world's leading astrobiologists and so on. So I simply wanted to ask these persons to do what they would do in such a scenario, in a scenario where it was a direct encounter with intelligent life and not per radio signal or something like that. And essentially, the film did not have a script as such. It has just been following their reaction to imagine that you're sitting with a alien entity and you can talk to it, what would you be inquiring about? What would you like to know? What would you explain about us? So in that sense, it's an exploration about what we don't know anything about, and I'm interested in that unknown, and I'm interested in what's possible for these people to imagine. And of course, all of them are acting on what they know. So for example, the former chief of defense staff in the UK, the elderly man, so that was the highest ranking military person in the UK some years ago. He's of course thinking from a military perspective, what would be the security aspects of this? What's the worst case scenario and so on. So they're all extrapolating from the known but into the unknown, and it's that exploration I'm interested in.
So what made you to choose this specific setup with all the experts?
I was simply thinking about if we had like an ideal scenario and not a scenario where an alien spacecraft lands in a remote area and talks with the cows or something like that, because another life form than humans or children, which might of course very well happen, but I'm interested in what I think of as the philosophical questions and the different areas of expertise and knowledge that I think would be brought to bear. So I simply thought, well, there'll be something about biology, there'll be something about theology, which you haven't seen, there'll be security aspects. So I tried to cover all those different areas. And then I tried to create a film in which these different questions, they come into play.
So what experience did you make with working with all these people, including scientists?
I mean, it was a good experience.
Kind species, a very strange species.
It's a species in itself, yes. And maybe something is hiding between them, who knows? No, but I think that initially when I started working on the film, I conducted an interview with an expert in space law. So that's the law that we have on Earth that in one sentence or one word perhaps alludes to the possibility of life elsewhere, or phenomena and so on. But that interview was conducted in the way that I said, what do you think it would mean if there would be aliens coming and so on? And he said, and then he started talking about, well, in that case, I think, and so on. And then I realized that it's not possible, I think, to make a film about this if they talk about as if I have to try and make a scenario in which this is the case, and you stay in that in a kind of role play. And then I made another interview with, that's the oldest gentleman you see in the film, and he's a pioneer of meta law, which is the idea that any intelligent being will have common interest in survival, so therefore you can essentially make a peace agreement. But when I interviewed him, I said that let's imagine that the camera is an alien, you can talk to it and so on, and you can ask all the things, you can say all the things that you perhaps would like to say if you actually could do it. And that was really interesting because he just went for it. And I realized that this is a person who's been thinking about these questions for all of his life. He's also a person who's been growing up with the space age when space exploration was a different thing also than it is today, I think. And essentially all of the experts, after I told them this is not a film about UFOs and I'm not interested in that, I think they all realized that this is actually what I'm thinking about, but I never thought about it in actually sitting, confronting a life form from elsewhere. But all my scientific work is actually about it. So I think that what happened was, at least, I think that these experts, they began to think about it from a new perspective and not from behind a thesis or a desk in a way.
Are there any questions from the floor at this point? Someone want to ask a question?
Yeah, maybe. So I've got a spare. All right. Thank you. So the full movie is very reactive in the sense that we react to an oncoming threat, but
There's also the possibility that we are maybe, everything is about time and coincidence here. So maybe we are not the ones who to receive a visit, but we are the visitors. Just from a philosophical point of view, this could indeed be the case.
I think that the common assumption is that we will be the one who finds somebody else because we are, at least in our own understanding, superior in some sense. I think that's how we humans understand ourselves. And that's something that I think that the film is interested in. But I think that
I mean, the human race could also be just from the average. It could be, maybe we are just the average intelligence in universe. But it could also be the fact that we
can
are
also be extremely mediocre.
Yeah, exactly. We could be the. So I'm always interested in, are we in the, where are we on this scale, and what are the
I'm tempted to think we're inferior.
yes, but in a way, the film is not interested in who is who and so on. And in many ways, of course, I use the alien idea as a vehicle for a exploration about who we are and what we think about ourselves. And there it has been interesting to be working with scientists who in a way works to some extent in a field of where certain knowledge is empirical evidence is valued. But I think that if we were able to meet a life form, then questions like, do you know what good and evil is? What is your morale? Will tell us more about such a life form than knowing the exact composure of the body and so on.
Just to throw in a bit of science here, if you look at the fact that evolution on Earth, life form started about 3.8 billion years ago. Humans exist on Earth for about 600,000 years. And evolution on Earth has a further few billion years to continue. So we have an extremely short time span that marks human evolution. So it is not too crazy to assume that it could be life forms existing somewhere that are far more evolved than ourselves. And evolution will not stop with human beings.
Thank you. Oh, it's very interesting, of course. Shots, but don't you think there's some conflict? You are at the moment you are talking about meeting extraterrestrial or alien life, and that which not always has to be intelligent. And the other moment you are talking about intelligence, to whom it would be interesting to talk and to exchange about moral ethics and so on, but that not always has to be a lie. So
in this film scenario, I sort of bypass everything and go to the ultimate scenario of intelligent life. I think that, yes, if we were to have contact at one point, it would most likely be by radio waves and so on. Then you can receive a signal, then we can wait for 50 years for a return signal and so on. But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in trying to have a case study in a way, or a scenario as ultimate as possible. You could also argue, why can you sit and speak English with this entity? I mean, that doesn't make sense. What if it has telepathy or whatever? So I'm just trying to go for the ultimate scenario, because that, I think, provides the most challenging questions. But it's true. I mean, Chris McKay, who's in the film, I think who is very much involved with the rover driving around on Mars right now looking for life. He expects to find fossilized bacteria and so on, and so that's his he's one of the world's leading experts. That's his expectation about life elsewhere. But of course, as he said, if it's intelligent, it's much more interesting, especially if they can get me some of his books, because there are books on natural philosophy and science and so on. But the idea behind the film was to try and go for the ultimate scenario, because most things becomes visible there. But what life will be in what form, I don't know.
Michael, I'm curious about your experience as a kind of visitor or as an outsider, as a filmmaker and an artist entering the community of scientists, and your relative freedom in proposing ideas that may be taboo in the scientific discourse. I mean, how
taboos in science? Do you think there are?
Yeah. No, I'm curious about your own experience as the encounter of.
No, but I think that Chris McKay is a good example in the sense that I mean, all of them had to be, as I said before, that this is not a UFO film and so on, and I really understand that, and also United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs also involved, and they also really need that assurance, and I really understand that. And initially, Chris said that I can only talk about bacteria, because that's what I think is possible. And then I said, well, it's clearly said in the beginning of the film, this is a speculation and so on and so on. But I'm quite sure that the reason why he prefers to talk about bacteria is that there are much fewer questions related to that, like morale and so on. In a way you can skip that. The worst thing, as another person that I work with in preparing the film said, for us to discover in terms of life elsewhere is a lower life form, because that will set the bar for anything else. And of course, as also in the film, some of the experience that we do have in finding other continents on Earth and other life forms and humans, but first, for example, called rational animals because they could talk and so on. So there are, but I think that I think the reason why these experts wanted to be in the film was that they actually just thought it thrilling to saying, okay, let's just imagine the full scale scenario, and what would that actually mean? Doug Vakots, who talks about what we've sent out into space, I mean, these actual attempts of communication and so on, and he's the head of the interstellar communication at the SETI Institute. He's the one who sits and waits for a radio signal in a way. He said that it was very, very difficult for me to reply back to you, Michael, because you said, let's imagine it's here. Because all my life I've been thinking about radio signals and decoding it and what to send back, zeros and ones and mathematics. And so that just, okay, let's just imagine all the things you dream about. Concretely, what clothes are you going to wear? Are you going to extend your hand? What if it smells? Those brought them into a different sort of also mindset. I think there is a moment in the interview with for example, Doug Vakots, where I actually thought he's going to cry now, because why are you here? Why are you here? He really wanted to know, and that was interesting. And that was simply this tool of trying to move the interview to do it in a different way. And the whole challenge and problem in making the film has, of course, been that there are no aliens in the film. There is no dialogue between an alien and a scientist, and it's all an attempt at getting closer to the unknown in a way. So, for example, the last clip you saw was perhaps difficult to see without the context, but where this one of the scientists enters the craft, that has something to do with the film about trying to compose a film that in a way moves into a different realm in a way that I think would be, that I think it would mean in a way. That's been very, very difficult to create.
I'm curious to know, in terms of the really unique approach you took with this film, if there are any other films or documentaries or even forms of media that sort of influenced the approach that you took with this film, and then what you think the potential impacts of this kind of approach can have on, other stories or scenarios that you might be interested in telling.
I don't know about influence, what it could have, but I think that in a way, the previous film that I made, called Into Eternity, in a way it talks to a hypothetical audience in the future. And in a way, this film is just more radical. The same thing. Now you're talking to an alien. But what's interesting about that is of course, also that, and you may not agree, the audience, but that in a way, you as an audience are put in the same shoe. So when they ask a question, do you have imagination? Then it also makes me think about what is that at all, imagination. So I think that any filmmaker should have should ask himself about the film's relationship to its audience and that dialogue. And the more, as I always say, the more you can make play out in people's heads, the more interesting it is. And so I think about this film as a piece of music and as a kind of double exposure. So you see something, you see this world that we are in, but you see it through the eyes of something else. So you also see something else. And so constantly, in a way, the editing, and it's been very, very difficult. But the idea is there that this entity is trying to understand what it sees and trying to match up things and so on.
Thanks. Speaking of the impact of this phenomenon when a documentary filmmaker meets scientists, on one hand it may have an impact on the audience, on the other hand it may have an impact on the scientists that are involved in this process. And I was wondering if any of the experts you spoke to were being sort of pushed out of their comfort zone by being a part of this film project. Because I'm thinking that if we really had an interaction with an extraterrestrial, what it's indicated in the clip so far is that the experts would go about doing their business. So one would focus on bacteria, another one would focus on security aspects and so on. Maybe humanity is not really able to actually evolve through the meeting with the extraterrestrial. They will sort of snap back to the comfort zone. I'm reminded of this South African film Camp 9 or whatever it's called, where there actually is aliens coming to Earth, and after a brief period of excitement, nobody knows what to do with it, so they put it in a sort of a refugee camp, and life goes on. So did you feel by raising this extreme scenario that some of these experts were actually willing to take a leap and actually may be ready to learn from the extraterrestrials?
I think in general there are two schools of, some people, they think that would be the salvation as a second renaissance, but if you can travel through the universe, you will be superior technologically and also socially and so on. And others, they think there will just be an innovation, that they'll come to take everything. But I think that these clips are from the first third of the film, and the film moves from a kind of outer questioning, for example, biology, into the question about what's a human being, for example. And that's where the real troubles begin, you can say. I think the response that I think is interesting for some of the experts, to me, has been that they have been... Doug Baker said, this is the best interview I've ever given. And another person in the film who you have instead, but he's the ethics advisor, he's a theologian, but the ethics advisor for the French Space Agency. He also had, I think, for him, a very special experience in doing this interview. But we'll have to ask them what it meant for them. But I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how they see a thing like this.
So again, you are really posing such a complex and profound questions, but have you started with, to my understanding, two most ultimate questions for your movie? So, what is life? Because I know about more than 100 definitions, and what is intelligence? And in this respect, have you any such clear statements on this? And another thing, it came back to my mind, this Polish writer, Stanislaw Lem, on the Solaris story, and so have you reflected also to some extent to this story in your movie? Thank you.
No, but I have of course been watching Solaris, and Tchaikovsky's version of it. And essentially you can say that Solaris is about this ocean planet where it's thought that there is a consciousness within that ocean, and there is this orbiting satellite space station, and things start to happen because perhaps this ocean can bring back memories or desires and so on, or longings, and that in a way takes control over the people who are there. And I think that Tchaikovsky's whole work, as is also in that film, is that there is something mysterious about life, and there are things that we don't know or cannot know. And I'm probably in the same boat or craft as he is. So I'm interested in the visit when the experts have problems in answering what is a human being, what is culture, and so on. So I think things that we take for granted are being questioned, or I'm trying to question in that film, because they are actually very, very difficult to explain if you suddenly sit for somebody who doesn't know anything, or as I said, just imagine you're sitting in front of a child. So that, and perhaps that's also that's perhaps also the when we're sitting in the science festival, scientific thinking is perhaps in a certain realm of reality, whereas some of the things that I really think would be the real questions in such an encounter, they belong to a different realm of human experience and understanding. I really much think so.
I'm so impressed with your approach and how you identify some of the most relevant questions. Why didn't you become a scientist?
Well,
or do you think you meanwhile became a scientist just in the process? Or?
No, but I think that scientific thinking has always been an interest of mine, because I do think that we are all thinking in a scientific way, and since the Renaissance, I think that's been the case for Westerners at least. I also think it's a certain way of thinking. I think when this previous film Into Eternity about nuclear waste and about the questions about how to make that safe for 100,000 years by burying it and so on, I've been meeting scientists who have been responsible for that, or scientists who have been working with those problems. And essentially, I get the impression that kind of scientists, engineers in particular, they have this idea that, well, as long as we just need to understand the problems, then we can solve it. That there is a kind of, the world can be explored to the bottom, and having the full understanding. That's my impression sometimes, but I don't think that is the nature of reality, really. But
I don't think it's the nature of science.
No. But I think that sometimes that's my impression that it creates a kind of simplistic approach to some things. But I'll be only interested to explore that further. But I think the idea that understanding is possible on all levels, that is both a very important idea and also dangerous at some point.
But from a scientist viewpoint, I can tell you that the most amazing thing about nature is how little we understand about it, not how much we understand about it. And that's why we're doing science, because we don't understand things.
So this is a question for you, Martin. In what way is this movie useful for scientists?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think one problem that has already been brought up, if you look at the typical scientist, most scientists tend to narrow down their views into very specific areas. Thinking about all the issues that this film raises, it really puts a lot of things into pretty much the widest possible context, because this film addresses almost everything that defines humanity.
I think we'll just leave it at that.
So I'm thinking about, did any of the experts discuss the notion of consciousness? Could we have a visitor that was intelligent, but for example, a machine or something like that, that you would be able to talk with, but didn't? You wouldn't think that they had a consciousness.
Well, I can say that one of the things that couldn't go into the film, unfortunately, but what was really interesting was the discussion about whether this entity could be a manufactured being. So it could be perhaps a biological life or an outright robot, but it could be manufactured and it could be sent as a kind of an envoy, and then report back in a way. But that idea came from some discussions about how to perhaps strike a kind of agreement. And this Dr. Fassan, the old man in the film, in the interview he talks about that it doesn't matter if you are artificial life as long as you're intelligent. This agreement that I propose also goes for you because you're intelligent, so you want to go on living and you realize that I want to go on living. So do to others what you want them to do to you and so on. And that meant that I started to ask the experts, because some of the questions were also just developed from the interviews or conversations. So I started to ask that in the film, you can say that I asked some questions on behalf of the entity. So at some points in the film, the experts, they repeat a question. So they say, for example, you're asking me, am I a manufactured being? And some of the experts, they gave some very interesting answer to that, because some said no. I'm born by mom and dad, and I've only seen photos, and I realize that's not a proof for you, but I can't believe that I'm not. Others said, in some ways I am, because I'm raised in a certain way, I live in a certain society, and so on. So that whole area of what constitutes, and you can say, and also in a certain sense, shapes consciousness, or the way you think or act and so on. That was something that was discussed, but we couldn't have it in the film, unfortunately. Another idea is, of course, that I know the SETI Institute is working with, is that a life form can have downloaded software in the World Wide Web as a kind of, that would be the most obvious place to make contact and so on. And there is a homepage where it says, if you are an alien life form, please write here. Yes, I am. Can you prove it?
Some responses were received.
Yes.
This is more of a scientific question directed at Martin, but I found it quite interesting, the fact that we understand human life, or life in general, as something that's DNA based. So in terms of thinking of life in different ways, what's going on in that field, and how is that being done?
One of the most tough questions. Actually, we think that RNA is more fundamental than DNA, because RNA in principle plays two different roles, and so one can think about RNA being a very fundamental thing. Can we think about something else? I think we're hitting here the limits of our imagination, because we don't know exactly how we would define life. So there's several approaches to it. Each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses. It's in the word imagination that we have to build on something that we already know and project it onto something else. So there are a lot of things that probably realistically exist in nature that are beyond our imagination. If we go back in history, we've actually seen that we've moved the forefront by coming up with new discoveries that actually told us something, that have just moved us forward into territory that was unimagined so far. Just think about everything that has to do with quantum physics. It's a completely groundbreaking concept that no one in the 19th century could have ever imagined. With biology, we're not in such a state yet. That actually makes the point why we should actually actively look for other life forms that could be quite different. I think if we can find life forms that are actually different, just by comparison, this is how we get information about ourselves. A fundamental problem that we're facing with planet Earth is there are several things that on planet Earth are just unique. Something that is unique cannot be understood. We need to compare. Still answers the question, but the problem is we're lacking of data. That just limits even the first attempt of scientific inquiry, which is imagination, which is then followed by speculation, exploration, and only finally by investigation. So we haven't even made the first step.
You briefly address in the movie what we're actively doing to make contacts. You mentioned the sound recordings and the images that are floating somewhere in outer space. Now, I know it's not the main focus of your film, but could you maybe, or do you elaborate on what we are actively doing to make this contact? What are we sending out, and what are we looking for? Because in some ways, I think this defines just as much how we as humans perceive communication and knowledge. We're sending out ones and zeros. What are these ones and zeros?
I think that there has been like two strategies, and you can correct me, Martin, but sending out scientific ones and zeros, maths and so on, because the idea has been that an intelligent being would also know what 1 + 1 is. But the question is, of course, why send something that is already known? What would that tell us about ourselves? And then, of course, that's probably the reason why there's been sent out music and these photographs and so on that particular spacecraft in 77, leaving the solar system as we speak. Because I think the argument has been that that would give a more true or comprehensive understanding of what we humans are. I think there's also another explanation, which could be that if anybody else knows science, then let's send some of our art, because that's where we have a little token of something more, something perhaps even divine. I think there is lurking a kind of cosmic inferiority complex in all of these things. So I also think, and it's also true, and that's also been talked about in the film at a later stage, that if there's one thing where we do differ from any other life form, may it be living inside stars or pure energy forms or consciousness or whatever, it's that we are humans. That we have a certain way of feeling things, emotional factors. Nobody else will be like us. But what that is, then that's of course an interesting question.
I mean, I much liked in the film, there were some very interesting connections in the pictures when it switches from the side between the sciences and the arts. I really loved it. I mean, both with the Mars that you see at some point that just comes after a model of the solar system, partly with the music that we hear. But I'm kind of opposed to making this distinction between the sciences and the arts, and put one, above the other, or say something is more advanced. And you see, for example, if you look at music, if you look at other forms of arts, if you look deeply into it, you would be surprised how much mathematics you find in the arts. Actually, there are lots of mathematicians who have a very strong fable for the arts and for music, because there are very close links.
But that question you're asking is, you can also try to answer it yourself by saying that if I should represent something that makes sense for another being about us, then what would that be? Which I think is a very, very good question. Should I show them some Lego, or my grades from high school, or I mean, as one of the experts actually suggested, I mean, if this happened, I'd like just to spend some time, sleep next to it, this being, just be there. It's actually Doug Wakers who says that, and we couldn't, and then he has a long break in the interview, and because we don't want to bore the audience, we couldn't have that perhaps, but I think he's very close to something, because that's I think how we link to other people are also very often by being together and sensing something.
Yes, you both talk about us comparing ourselves to the aliens, knowing more about our human nature, our conscience, and also about our life form. But when scientists are looking for planets that could be inhabited with life forms, they look for planets that look like Earth with an atmosphere. So what are the likelihood that the life form that we actually see is similar to ours?
We don't have any idea. I think we're actually very far from looking at any signatures of life on any of the planets we've detected. We actually, moreover, don't have any good idea what makes a planet really Earth-like. How Earth-like does a planet have to be a good home for life forms? So if you look at the simple picture that some people think about, is you have a planet that has approximately the same mass, same size, same mass density, and same temperature as Earth. Think about how complex Earth is in its structure, in its geology. You can easily imagine a planet that has the same temperature, same mass of the Earth. It would be completely different from Earth. One of the most striking features about planet Earth is the presence of the moon. Particularly if you think about the evolutionary history of the moon, which might have arisen from a collision with another body on Earth, where the moon resulted from the debris of a collision. This could not have left Earth unchanged. So if you have a planet that didn't have this evolutionary history, probably the chance for life would have been completely different. So we're completely lacking of any data on this. That's what we should really look for. But also we have very little idea what we're actually looking for. So One of my favorites is the yogurt challenge. Imagine you go to the next supermarket, you buy a pot of yogurt. You know there's life in the yogurt, right? Put it 1 meter distance. You're not allowed to touch. How do you prove that there's life in the yogurt? Can someone come up with a good idea? I think so far there's no test anyone could come up with that proves that there's life in the yogurt. It's just 1 meter away from you. And just by remotely sensing it by means of any electromagnetic radiation, you will not find that there's life in the yogurt. Now we're looking at these planets, right? So the nearest to us that we know, they're about 20 light years away from us. So we're trying to look for any signatures of life. Atmospheres currently, they can tell us something about gases in the atmosphere. Does it really mean that there's life on it? Actually, one of the most amazing things about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is it has a better defined signature. So the probability actually to find intelligent life, an intelligent life as a similar evolutionary stage as us, just let's say within about 100 years, the probability is much smaller. The signature is better defined, and the search space is larger. We can search throughout the whole Milky Way galaxies. So maybe that probability is higher. Well, again, it's a maybe. So we're currently in the situation where we're being provided with completely new opportunities to search, to explore. What we will find, we have no idea. But actually, that motivates us to go and look for it. Because if we already knew the outcome, there would be no point in actually doing the search. So again, the most typical answer of a scientist to a question is don't know.
So I have a question of what is the main goal of doing this type of film about aliens, because do you share the same idea of, or the same interest as the scientists do? Because you talk a little bit about that you're actually interested in the anthropology of humanity and how we can learn something about humanity by imagining something about the aliens. But I guess the question is whether the scientists have the same approach or the same idea. And I guess that's one part of the question. But the other question is that can we expect that this is a friendly engagement? Because I think this is really just about that. How can we talk about with the aliens? But actually, if we look into the sci-fi films, we often see that it's a war, and it's a question of whether we should actually, how can we survive as humans in the relationship with the aliens? And also the biologists said it also, that actually there's this challenge of whether we can survive with our biology if there's other biology targeting us. And then the question is, in one of the first Aliens films, there was this question of the question was raised: how far should we go into finding knowledge about the aliens? Because actually, the way the scientists actually they were seeking knowledge about the aliens, but the result was actually that they woke something that was bad for humanity. So the question is, what is the ethics about doing this type of research?
It has been discussed and suggested not to send out signals because that would draw attention to us. And if somebody is nasty,
there's no agreement about that.
No, it's just some people say that. But I think that The War of the Worlds is probably the book that has set forth the popular imagination or the image in popular culture about aliens coming to attack us. That book is written in 86 or something, and it's an allegory over the British Empire and how they treated the rest of the world. Think about if somebody came and did the same thing here in the UK than you doing anywhere else. So it's a reflection about life on Earth. Again, because we probably can't go beyond. I mean, the unknown is always seen in the light of the known. We can't. So therefore, and it's also more dramatic for narrative purposes to do things like that. But one thing that I was really, really surprised, and it was actually a little bit scary when making the film, was that when discussing, okay, something has come to Earth with this former chief of defense staff in the UK. His concerns about panic, riots, chaos, simply by not knowing what this means. And that is, this is a person whom actually, and he has the whole of the British state's military assets in his toolbox, and he has been using it. So for him, so they were discussing, for example, should we send a Trident submarine with nuclear arms in position so we can bomb them? No, we shouldn't do that because they'll probably detect that we are moving things around, and we shouldn't sort of try to, and so on. But for him, it's a toolbox. And what I found surprising was his genuine concern about, if we can't control the situation, if we can't explain to the public, as the spokesperson from the British Prime Minister talks about, then things can escalate by itself in a way. Probably also because of this public image about that might be threatening. But I think all of those things goes back to the discovery of the new world and our experiences between ourselves about how to treat other people. And I don't know if I mean, there is another expert that I've been discussing this, she's not in the film, but for her, that perception, preconception, would be decisive. It doesn't matter if they come with candy and they look good and they're nice, we would react with aggression, is her fear.
You talked about surprise. While you were working on the film, what was the largest surprise that you encountered?
Well, I think it's probably how difficult it is to make that film, because I thought it would be easier, to be honest. But I was genuinely surprised by the authorities' aspects. I mean, the military and the public spokesperson. I was surprised how close their reaction is to the typical Hollywood scenario. Something comes and panic breaks out, and things spiral out of control. I was surprised about that genuine concern. And I was also a little bit surprised about how conscious they are about, well, we just have to say something because it's better than, they'll just keep it calm for a moment and so on. I mean, how cynical those people are, and I think for good reasons.
I find it particularly interesting to see how little we know about the social interactions between people and how we can predict them. So if we think, we're always discussing about policy making and the importance of evidence. But if we try to communicate any evidence-based policy and we ignore the emotions and the fears that people have, it will fail. Because people don't act as rational as we would like to see them. And it's actually been proven how irrational human decisions can be. And it's kind of built in. I mean, even if scientists say, we educate everyone about scientific thinking, there seems still something being built in humans that make them act in an irrational way.
Yeah, actually my question is regarding the same topic, and at the end I think that assuming that if we manage to communicate with such beings, assuming that they have the same rationality and way of understanding, and that we can actually understand each other, not just the language barrier, but the way of thinking, and that's a very deep question if you think about how our way of thinking has evolved through our history, and we're only talking about 5,000 years, and we have changed our view of the world dramatically in the last 150 years. So to be able to communicate and to understand, so at the end I think that when you propose a question in the scenario, you're just getting an answer filtered through your understanding. And then I'm curious about how can we explore that. I mean, that's a limitation on the whole project, I guess.
But that's my interest in making the film, and perhaps the biggest surprise was actually that the more, in a way, these experts they try to explain something about who we are, the more difficult it gets, for the reasons that you mentioned there. There is another expert that I was interviewing. He's not in the film, but he also talked about that because we live on a certain planet with certain physical conditions and certain experiences, and it means that we have a biology that means that certain types of that we understand things in a certain way just from our biology, and another planet will be another planet. So another life form will be different. It may have, see light have a vision in a different spectral thing. It won't see. And Weikart also talks about that. The real revolution here is not that we met you. It will come in hundreds of years when we understand just a little bit about how different you are. And that's the interest in the film is to if this would happen, it would be, I think, a mirror, very strange mirror for ourselves to look into and get some kind of reflection back on ourselves, because I think it would make us see things that we can't see by ourselves, just like the good friend can tell you something that you don't really know about yourself, or a bad friend or whatever. But it's that exterior view that the film is interested in creating and trying to push and go along with these scientists as far as possible down that road into those obvious things about, or perhaps not, we don't perhaps see that obvious, but I really think that what's the limits to what we can understand, to what we can imagine? Do we have any kind of access to what is fundamentally unknown?
I think the time is up, actually. That's a great way to end this. And thank you, Mikael and Martin. Give them a big round of applause. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all the good questions. I hope we'll see you at the Copenhagen Docs in November. And I hope I'll see you right out in the bar for a beer or a soda or anything else. And you'll have a good night. Thank you.